Okay, Chapter 6, Part 3. We're going to start out by going through a couple of example questions to drive a point home that I think you really need to understand for the unemployment rate. So let's imagine there's a tiny little community and this is their current situation. Okay, if we solved for their unemployment rate, that would be 4 divided by 20, which is 20%. And if we solve for their labor force participation rate, that would be 20 divided by 30, which is 2/3 or 66.7%. Okay, so let's imagine that in this tiny community, two people give up looking for a job. Two people that were looking for a job stop looking. What would that change? Well, it doesn't affect the employment, but it does affect the unemployment. So unemployment would go down to 2, okay? And the eligible population would stay the same, and the employed would stay the same. Okay, and the result here is the unemployment rate is now 2 out of 18, which is 11.1%. And the labor force participation rate is still, or no, I'm sorry, it changes too. Is now 18 over 30, which is, I believe that's 60%. So this illustrates why we need to be very careful when dealing with unemployment rates, and also why the labor force participation rate is something that's very useful to us. Okay, in this scenario, if I just focus on the unemployment rate, right? If I just focus on the unemployment rate, I could say the unemployment rate went down. And you can imagine politicians who, for whatever reason, want the economy to look stronger than it really is, might say, look, the unemployment rate dropped, so I'm doing a really good job and the economy is strengthening. But in reality, the economy isn't strengthening. If anything, it's getting worse. These two people that were unemployed are now not even trying to find a job anymore. It's like they became so discouraged they gave up. And in fact, in economics, that's what we call these people, discouraged workers. These are the people that simply have given up on looking for a job. And these are important to consider because it will create these sort of wacky circumstances here. You can see now why the labor force participation rate is a good thing for us to think about, because the labor force participation rate drops here, even though the unemployment rate is also dropping. Usually, if the unemployment rate drops, that's a good thing, but we could go to the labor force participation rate to find out if that really is the case. And what we see here is the labor force participation rate is also dropping, which may be a sign of discouraged workers, okay? So if we're really trying to get a snapshot of the economy, we need to think about the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. And a lot of times in the news and a lot of times from politicians, they won't do that, either because they don't understand the labor force participation rate or because they're trying to spin their own story, right? They're trying to make it look better than it really is or worse than it is for whatever reason. Here is the general rule of thumb when it comes to the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. Let me do a little table here. We've got the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate, and let's think about 4 different scenarios here. Scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, where the unemployment rate is either going up or down, and the labor force participation rate likewise is either going up or down. Okay, so there's the 4 different possibilities. If we're checking through time, the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate can each either go up or down. Here are the 4 possibilities. And so let's think about what we can learn from these. Okay, so if the unemployment rate and the labor force participation rate both go up, is that a good sign or a bad sign? Okay? Unemployment rate going up, usually that's a bad sign. Labor force participation rate going up, usually that's a good sign. So the outcome here is unknown. Okay, so what we're basically trying to show here is the outcome. What can we learn from these two figures? So to explain this and why this is really uncertain, one possibility that could drive both of these up, what if a bunch of people enter the labor force? What if a bunch of people think, wow, the economy now is strong, so I'm going to start looking for a job? Well, when they start looking for a job, that's going to cause them to be unemployed, driving that rate up. It's also going to cause them to enter the labor force, driving that rate up. So it could be a good sign. But that's not the only possibility. Maybe another possibility is workers are losing their jobs, and so stay-at-home parents. So imagine there's a lot of situations where the dad is working and the mom is not, right? Well, maybe in that case, if the dad loses his job, he's unemployed, and maybe moms now enter the labor force looking for a job too. Well, that could cause both of these to go up, and that'd be the sign of a really bad economy. It's hard to tell in this situation if it's good or bad. You then need to get more specific and focus on other issues, such as what's happening with salaries, what's happening with layoffs, things like that. So in this scenario, we shouldn't just look at these two figures, but it's a good thing we looked at the labor force participation rate, because if we just focus on this, we might have said, okay, the economy's bad. It's getting worse, right? But this tells us to look and think, I don't really know what's going on here, okay? Second scenario, unemployment rate goes up, labor force participation rate goes down. Think that's good or bad? That one, I think we pretty much know what's going on. This is probably a sign of a worsening economy. So worsening job market conditions might be the way to explain this. Probably what's happening is unemployment rate's going up because it's harder and harder to keep a job. The labor force participation rate is going down because people are leaving the labor force because they are discouraged. They're giving up on looking for a job. In other words, some people are losing their job, causing unemployment, and then some of the people who are unemployed realize there's no hope, so they give up, driving the labor force participation rate down. Okay, number 3. What do you think about number 3? Unemployment rate goes down, labor force participation rate goes up. This is usually a good sign if the unemployment rate goes down, and this is usually a good sign when the labor force participation rate goes up. So this is improving conditions. Most likely. Okay, it's not a guarantee, but I would say more than 90% of the time, if both of these are happening, that means the economy is getting better. Probably what's happening is the people who are unemployed are finding jobs more often, and because the conditions are so good, you've got people entering the labor force trying to find a job. And then the last one here, they both go down. This is usually a good sign. This is usually a bad sign. So this is a scenario where we really don't know what's going on. Again, we could come up with some different possibilities here, but ultimately we really don't know. Okay, so for example, an example of a good situation is maybe the economy is getting better, causing the unemployment rate to go down, more people are finding jobs, and maybe the economy is so much better that people are retiring early, and so they're leaving the labor force. It's just one possibility. But ultimately, we really don't know in these two scenarios, and what we would need to do is look for more information. And so part of what we're doing in this class is teaching you to be skeptical and teaching you to understand that things aren't that simple. You really need to dive into it. So if you hear a politician saying, oh, the unemployment rate's going down, things are great, I'm doing a good job, first of all, the politician probably isn't causing that most of the time. But secondly, unemployment rate's going down, not necessarily a sign of an improving economy. Not necessarily, okay? All right, so we're getting close to the end of this chapter. Got just a little bit more left. So we talked about being employed, unemployed, part of the eligible population, all of that. Let's now talk about types of unemployment. And we've got two that we want to go over here to start with. Frictional unemployment. So now we're thinking about why somebody would be unemployed from a macroeconomic perspective. You might think, well, some people are unemployed because they're not good workers. Well, that person probably should be unemployed, right? But let's think about why people might be unemployed for macroeconomic reasons, okay? One reason why people might become unemployed, and this will probably happen to you at some point in your lives, is a person becomes unemployed due to changing market conditions. Okay, so let's discuss that first part of it. A person becomes unemployed due to changing market conditions. That sounds kind of vague, and it is vague. It's intentionally vague. Changing market conditions can mean a lot. So for example, let's imagine that all classes move to an online setting. Well, if all classes move to an online setting, probably what's going to happen is a lot of teachers are going to lose their job, a lot of professors. Because if we move to an online setting, I could teach 20,000 students right now, and the lectures would be identical, right? Don't need as many professors if you're teaching online. So if that's the case, people would be unemployed. It's not because of a bad economy, right? It's just because of changing market conditions. Another example that these are all things that I think we may eventually experience. But for example, let's say that Milledgeville, let's say a bunch of businesses in Milledgeville close down. Well, if a bunch of businesses in Milledgeville close down, the college may lose a lot of enrollment, and maybe I lose my job just because enrollment's down at Georgia College. It doesn't have anything to do with my skills or the macro economy. It just has to do with market conditions here in Milledgeville, okay? So maybe something like that happens. Frictional unemployment refers to the scenario where a person becomes unemployed due to changing market conditions. This person will eventually find employment. Because her skills are still useful. Okay, so for example, in the Milledgeville example, if enrollment at Georgia College is down and I get laid off, I've got a PhD in economics, right? I can go find a job somewhere else. So that's called frictional unemployment. It's kind of like, as the economy changes, there's a certain amount of friction. Some people, they kind of get rubbed off the market, right? They get pushed out of the market, but they can find their way back in because their skills are still useful. Probably if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that this happens to you at some point, right? For example, let's say we figure out a way to make automobiles run on water. They don't have to use gasoline anymore. We figured out some sort of hydroelectric process. Well, if automobiles are running on water, you can imagine there's going to be tons of people who lose their jobs who are in the gasoline industry. And some of those people still have skills that are useful for something else. They'll be able to find a job. Okay? So that's frictional unemployment. The other type of unemployment is structural unemployment. All right, and these two, I kind of think of these as very similar in my head because the unemployment begins because of the same reason. So a person becomes unemployed due to changing market conditions. So the same type of things that could cause it in frictional could cause it here. So for example, population goes down in Milledgeville, or we figure out a way to make cars run on water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Market conditions are always changing. Some people are affected for it in different ways. To give you one more example, let's imagine you're working at a restaurant. Maybe some of you watching this video are working at a restaurant right now. And let's say your restaurant fails simply because the manager of the restaurant is terrible. Okay, let's say you're a really good waiter. You're a really good waiter and your restaurant closes down just because your manager is really bad. Well, probably your skills are still useful, so you'd be able to find a job somewhere else. So you would be probably frictionally unemployed. Structural unemployment is when your skills are no longer useful. So this person is unable to find employment because his or her skills are no longer useful. So this is the case where your skills have basically become outdated or obsolete. So imagine if we figure out a way to make automobiles run on water, there's going to be some people who are frictionally unemployed. So for example, let's say that there's an engineer that works at an offshore oil rig. Well, that engineer probably will be able to find work once automobiles run on water because that engineer probably has skills that can be applied to a lot of different things, right? An engineer can help with construction of various different things, not just oil rigs. But imagine some workers whose only skills are in gasoline and oil. Those workers, their skills are probably not useful anymore. To give another example, let's imagine that the only skill that I have is driving a vehicle, and I'm a professional driver. Maybe I'm a truck driver. Well, if we figure out a way to make self-driving cars become the thing, then there's going to be a lot of drivers who are out of work. And if my only skill is to drive a truck, and now we have self-driving vehicles, I'm going to lose my job, and I'm going to be structurally unemployed because my skills are no longer useful. For these people to get rehired, all they got to do is apply for jobs. This is going to be temporary. For these people to get rehired, they're going to have to develop new skills. Okay? So these people must develop new skills. Okay? The key thing to recognize here is that even though this sounds bad, from a macroeconomic standpoint, both of these are okay. They're okay because market conditions, right? These are caused by changing market conditions. Markets need to change. If we figure out a way to make automobiles run without drivers, that's a good thing for the economy as a whole, right? It's going to make products cheaper. It's going to make the roads safer. It can do a lot of benefits. On net, we're going to be better off, but there will be some people who are worse off. But this is unavoidable. There's always going to be a certain amount of unemployment because of changing market conditions. Okay? So we lump all of this together into something called natural unemployment. So frictional unemployment and structural unemployment are both examples of natural unemployment. Okay, so I'm going to erase this and then we're going to define natural unemployment. So natural unemployment is unavoidable unemployment that results from changing market conditions. Okay, and I say it's unavoidable. The only way to try to avoid it is for the government to get involved. That's not a good idea, okay? You might be thinking, well, we need to worry about these truck drivers that are going to lose their job. Yeah, we need to worry about them in the sense to make sure that they, are able to get back on their feet, that they have the ability to get trained in other areas. But I don't think the right thing to do would be, let's just, not allow self-driving cars and allow these people to keep driving the trucks. To give a similar example, imagine if back in the 1910s, if we'd said, you know what, there's this new automobiles being created by Henry Ford. We're afraid this is going to hurt the covered wagon businesses. So we're going to let the covered wagon businesses keep selling covered wagons. We're not going to allow automobiles to be created. The problem is when you do that, yeah, it's going to save those covered wagon producers, but it's going to really hurt our economic progress, okay? So natural unemployment is just, it's going to happen. There's really not much you can do about it. What we think right now in the U.S. is we think that the unemployment rate should be ideally about 4.5%. Okay? And the reason it should be ideally at 4.5% is because we think if it's 4.5%, then that means that everybody who's unemployed is unemployed due to changing market conditions. In other words, if the unemployment rate is 4.5%, then all of the unemployment is natural. Okay? So sometimes we'll refer to this as the natural unemployment rate. It's a really important term moving forward, the natural unemployment rate. For this class, this is something we're going to come back to a lot. So that's actually the best case scenario, okay? So you might have been tempted before seeing this to think the best case scenario is an unemployment rate of 0%. But if the unemployment rate is 0%, that means that nobody's getting laid off, right? And if nobody's getting laid off, there must not be any economic progress. If there's going to be economic progress, there do need to be restaurants that close down because they're poorly run or because people don't like that type of food anymore, right? Those places do need to close down. If there's people's skills who are becoming obsolete, they should become unemployed. So there's a certain amount of unemployment that is just bound to happen. That's fine, okay? The unemployment we're concerned with is the cyclical unemployment. And this is the unemployment due to a bad economy. So this is the unemployment that is beyond natural unemployment, okay? So if I get laid off, it could be because changing market conditions, so maybe I get laid off here in Georgia College because people are moving out of Milledgeville and I go get a job at Mercer, for example. So that'd be frictional. Could be structural. I lose my job as a professor because everything's turning automated. We don't need as many faculty members. So I get laid off. My skills are no longer useful. I got to learn something else. Third possibility is cyclical unemployment. Maybe the economy is just so bad that the state of Georgia can't afford to pay me anymore and I get laid off. Okay? It doesn't have anything to do with changing market conditions. It just has to do with the economy shrinking in general. Okay? This is the unemployment that we really fear. This is the unemployment that we really care about because this is avoidable. There's no particular reason why we need to have cyclical unemployment. Okay? So the ideal cyclical unemployment rate is 0. Ideally, there would be no unemployment. Or, missing a word there. Ideally, there would be no cyclical unemployment. But oftentimes there is. Okay, so we're getting real close now to the end of this chapter. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Example 1, let's say that the unemployment rate is 8.2%. Okay? So based on that information, in the U.S., solve for the cyclical unemployment rate. Okay, and as I said before, we think the natural unemployment rate is 4.5%, and I should have clarified that's in the U.S. So we think that the natural unemployment rate is 4.5%. Okay, so what that means is the cyclical unemployment rate is the actual unemployment rate minus the natural rate. Okay, and let's not make this confusing because this is very simple. All we're saying here is if this is 8.2%, 4.5% initially comes from natural. So what's on top of that must be cyclical. Okay, so if the unemployment rate is 8.2% and 4.5% is the natural rate, then the cyclical unemployment rate must be 3.7%. Okay, what that means is 3.7% of the labor force is composed of people who are unemployed just because the economy is bad. So this is really problematic because this is human suffering right here, right? This is people who are unemployed and they don't need to be unemployed. If we had made better decisions in our economy, we may have been able to avoid this unemployment. Can't really do anything about the natural, okay? That's going to happen, but this could be avoided, so we'd like to avoid it. Let me give you one more example here. Let's say the unemployment rate is 3%. Might sound impossible, but it's actually not. And this is maybe a less obvious. This makes sense, I think. Students, when they see this makes sense. This seems a little strange, but this is actually possible and actually not that uncommon. In this scenario, the cyclical unemployment rate would be equal to 3% minus 4.5%. So we get a negative 1.5% cyclical unemployment rate. Okay? This is strange. What's basically happened here is the unemployment rate is below the natural unemployment rate. This is the percent of people that should be unemployed in a normal economy, but we're actually lower than this. So what's happening here is the economy is so strong that there are actually more people working than there really should be. That sounds like a good thing, and in the short run it is. But the problem is, in the long run, this can cause some big problems, okay? And we're going to talk about that at length when we get to chapter 10, so down the road a bit. This can be an example of something called an inflationary gap. So we'll see that here in the future. So sometimes the unemployment rate can be too high, like you see here. That's bad for obvious reasons. Lots of people unemployed. That's not good. The unemployment rate can also probably be too low, too. This is bad for more subtle reasons that we'll get to later on. Okay, and I believe that does it for chapter 6. It's a long chapter, and I went through it quickly. This chapter would take me a lot longer to cover if I was doing this in person, because there'd be questions and we'd be going over examples and that sort of thing. But I don't think that's necessarily all that helpful to you guys to try to run through a bunch of questions. Rather, I'm going to post the worksheets. I'm going to provide solutions there, and you guys email me if you have any questions. All right, thanks for watching.